tell us about the moment you realised geography is more than just maps and spaces.
When I first think about geography, I don't even think about maps and spaces. I only think that I learned about the significance, like the socio-political significance of maps and spaces when I was at university. I grew up in West London, which was surrounded by various different green spaces. And in those green spaces, I was able to interact with the living world, or nature, as some also may say. And so that's where my interest of geography, or just interaction with the world around me, really began. And from that, when I actually started learning about geography in school, I actually learned about how human influence so easily affects and influences nature. It helped to lead the Decolonizing the curriculum agenda. And in this, I must say, this was 2018, so there wasn't as much urgency around the agenda as there is now. So I kind of was thinking that in curriculums, again broadly, it's kind of always the same writers. Some lecturers may not change the recommended authors or core authors from their programs for years, even decades, and so on and so on. And I really wanted to learn more about voices that I hadn't heard from, and I had lots of questions that weren't answered from the texts. And I know that other people also had the same. And so that's what really came from Decolonizing the curriculum. It's about deconstructing our knowledge. It's about thinking critically and reflecting what we've been learning to really expand knowledge. Knowledge is not perfect, but you can always expand it and continue to learn.
How do you think the climate crisis uniquely impacts the Black diaspora, and what knowledge or action do you think is most urgent?
I think that I can only speak to my own experience because, of course, the Black diaspora in Brazil, in China, in Australia, even France, completely, we have different understandings of life. I think, in fact, everybody's connection to the environmental crisis is unique. But I think for me, my connectedness with the Caribbean really does shape my understanding of the climate crisis. In the UK, I think we are very shielded from the climate crisis. We're not experiencing hurricanes. We're not experiencing +4 degrees of temperature, even though this has been the warmest spring on record.
What are your hopes for the next generation and how they'll engage with climate justice?
I'm actually really excited to see how the next generation are continuing and will continue to engage with climate crises. I hope that they can see that we've tried to do a lot when it comes to impact and trying to minimize the environmental crises. I can't say it's enough. Will it ever be enough? I don't know. Who knows? But I would hope that they don't think that we haven't done enough. I would hope that they are innovative. I would also hope that they amplify voices that haven't been uplifted prior.
Hi, that's Circle Family, and welcome back. I'm joined today by our fabulous guest, Adwoa Amankona. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to chat.
I'm really looking forward to this chat. So you are a geographer and environmental advocate. You've also been award-winning on your dissertation, Black Geographies, and that's pretty extraordinary. And I just wanted to kind of give a little bit of context for the chat today. So you and I, we very briefly met in Soho House. It was International Women's Day. We were sat next to each other, and as you do, what do you do? What do you do? We had a little chit chat, and what struck me is just even in that brief moment, and you said, kind of climate crisis and what you do. I was like, that's so fascinating because I just don't think that in terms of our community, it's really at the forefront. We're not involved in that conversation. So this is why I was like, you know what, come on the podcast and talk about it. How do we bring this to the masses, Really. So let's kind of dig into it. And, I always like to start at the beginning of one's journey. So your kind of love for geography and where it began. So tell us about the moment you realised geography is more than just maps and spaces.
Do you know what's so funny is actually this question. When I first think about geography, I don't even think about maps and spaces. I only think that I learned about the significance, like the socio-political significance of maps and spaces when I was at university. This was not in school or anything like that. I did think the globe was cool, but I had no kind of like affinity or interest to it. But I did really have a curiosity to some animals, not all animals, not dogs.
Oh, wow. You're not a dog person.
I'm a cat person.
Same.
I'm a cat person. I also really loved horses and insects and plants, and just being able to touch the greenery around me. And I think, although I did grow up in a council flat, I grew up in West London, which was surrounded by various different green spaces. And in those green spaces, I was able to interact with the living world, or nature, as some also may say. And so that's where my interest of geography, or just interaction with the world around me, really began. And from that, when I actually started learning about geography in school, I actually learned about how human influence so easily affects and influences nature. And then therefore it kind of went on and developed to studying my geography degree at UCL and in London, and then also going on to study a master's degree at the University of Oxford in political ecology, environmental studies, and then also a tad of economics in there as well. I'll throw that in there too. Yeah. So I guess that's how it really began.
Right, exactly. And, you said you mentioned about growing up in London, council estate, and kind of like the educational challenges around there. And I know just a little bit of research that you discovered you had dyslexia right before you started university, which is, so kind of how did your own educational path shape how you see space, place and access?
Of course. So I think touching on the dyslexia aspect, I think, as I've just said, I went to UCL and Oxford. I actually was not the smartest cookie in the jar when I was younger. I even was described to my mum by one of my teachers as being quite dumb because I didn't focus in school. Yeah,
I used the dumb word.
Yeah, they did.
Gosh.
And my mum was obviously not very happy about that whatsoever and was making an effort at home. I think there was obviously some kind of developmental challenges that I was experiencing, and that was evidenced by my dyslexia test, which was taken after my A-levels. This is after I had to have, lots of extracurricular lessons in in English and maths throughout primary school, which wasn't, this is not private tutorial things. This is literally the school being like, your child needs this. So it was quite crazy to be from that and then really find what interests me and really understand how my brain works in a sense of, I don't necessarily think in the same way as somebody who is not dyslexic thinks. And I even think within dyslexia is a spectrum. I don't think the same as another dyslexic person. I don't view the world in that way. But coming back to kind of education in space, drawing upon my time at UCL, I think when I think of place and space and my connection to understanding the world and how that shaped my interest in geography, that is, of course, in political ecology, but it's also in this area of Black geographies. Now, UCL, although it doesn't like to say it's an elitist education, it does carry some form of elitism, as well as many of the Golden Triangle universities across the UK. But UCL was actually one of the first universities to allow women and also people of any class to enter its doors. But again, when we think about interacting with space and place, you have to think about the historical context. And the historical context of UCL that I also thought of, as well as the aspect that that allowed anyone of class and gender to be educated, was also that it propelled an agenda which pushed colonial conquest. For example, UCL pioneered eugenics, which is a pseudoscience. Yes. Right. So just briefly, eugenics is a pseudoscience which depicts intelligence and I guess human quality based on biology. And obviously in that they placed white people at the top and Black people at the bottom. And that went into World War II. That goes into various different justifications of why colonial discoverers or sailors and people like that could do what they were doing in other countries, could basically denote them as uncivilized, barbaric, savage, and all these other
justification.
Yes, right. Exactly, really colonial words. So that kind of shaped my understanding of the world, and that was where I became really interested in this idea of space and place and how different people interact with that space differently. You may not have the same interaction with UCL as I do, or some other friends may not have the same interaction as I do, but that was my interaction with place and space and I guess a little bit of access at the beginning there.
Yeah, that's incredible. You're perceived to kind of be on the back foot because you've had this, dyslexia that's been undiagnosed, but you've still managed to kind of rise to go to one of the top 10 global universities. And how did you feel with those challenges in hearing teachers say that you're dumb, or just being on the back foot? How did you face those challenges?
Of course. So thankfully I didn't hear the teacher say I was dumb.
Right.
But I definitely knew that I was slower than some people in my class. But I think when I caught up and when I I think when I caught up and when I found what I was really interested in, and I found a lot of education just so boring, repetitive. I even found history and geography at the beginning really boring because they weren't really focusing on things that I was interested in. For example, as much as I find learning about World War II interesting, I don't need to learn about it 4 times, in the same way. I'm not actually developing anything else.
Yeah.
But if they were to talk about World War II and the fact that actually there was a large population of Commonwealth citizens as well in the army, so from South Asia, from West Africa, from across Africa, from the Caribbean, were also part of that army, perhaps I may be more interested in World War II. I can't say for sure, but I think I would be more interested in learning more about, other voices across the world which weren't really amplified in history and geography at the time. In terms, again, of challenges and coming back from challenges, so another challenge that I faced in sixth form actually was that my secondary school that I went to was not a very good secondary school, let's put it that way.
Right.
And a lot of people underachieved. In my first year of year 12, I actually got 3 Ds and a U, which was enough to get into year 13, but not enough to actually go to a decent university. So I had to retake. And that was really challenging because lots of my friends had continued or have actually moved to another college, and I had to be with the year below, which at the time, you're like, oh, year below, like that's not like, why am I with them kind of thing. But actually I had lots of friends in the year below, so it ended up being okay. But I think in terms of overcoming challenges, you just have to remember that you can really only do as well as you can.
Absolutely.
But you shouldn't take a downfall as it is. If you know that you can continue to improve, then you really should. And if you have the option to do that, then you should. I had the option to continue and go into year 13 with the 3 Ds and a U, but I was like, that's actually not good enough for me personally. So I retook, and thankfully I got enough to then get into a good 2 high profile universities later on in life. But yeah, I would say that was really challenging. That was not a nice place to be. But here we are anyway.
But the story of persistence there,
Absolutely.
just keep going. And also I think it sounded like very early on you found where you was aligned. Like you said, okay, you weren't really into history in the sense that it's been taught in, but it's like, let's look at how we can find representation and make it kind of match to things that interest us.
Absolutely.
And I don't think that happens enough in education. And I think that's why we lose so many kids. And it's just like you said, it becomes boring, becomes repetitive. So it was good that you could find some alignment as early as you did in that. Okay, so let's change gears a little bit. And I know at the top of the conversation we spoke about Black Geographies. And so, when we're talking about the intersection of race and class and geography, your dissertation focused on Black Geographies. And so for listeners unfamiliar, what does that term mean?
Of course. So Black Geographies is really a study in cultural identity geographies, but also, I guess, cultural identity studies. It's a critical theorization of how Black identities and cultures throughout time have interacted with space. They shape space. Space inherently shapes them. And it's learning about how that takes place in the dominant world order or just systems of power, whether that's the patriarchy, whether that's colonization. There are lots of different examples in which people can extract or theorize from. And I think that it's also important in Black geographies to acknowledge that Black being is not just about literally being in a space. It's about resistance. It's about agency. It's about all these different things in which Black people have had to do or just do as a collective or as individuals throughout history. And so yes, that's what Black geographies is. There are many different readers and fantastic writers, including McKittrick, Knoxolo, Hall, Gilroy, Du Bois, Angelo, and the list kind of goes on. But that's Black geographies in a nutshell.
I love that. And also, just again doing my little research on you as I do. On your website you said, and this is I am what a geographer looks like.
Yes.
And I found that statement so powerful. So can you expand a little bit more on that?
Absolutely. So I think when I say to people that I don't say necessarily right now I'm a geographer, but when I did say to people I was a geographer when I was studying geography, they were like, oh, you do geography? And then they were kind of like, wasn't expecting that, or, like, what is that? Or why did you choose that? Or even like, expecting you to say something like law or medicine or something more traditional or something that perhaps in a The thing is, I don't like to homogenize, but a lot of my friends at university, or a lot of Black people I know who go to UCL and Oxford or Cambridge or any kind of elitist institutions, they're usually doing medicine, law, engineering, and things like that, because they've kind of been either pushed into this, either they want to do it, of course, or they've been kind of encouraged or pushed into it by their parents because it's deemed as something which is secure, always going to be necessary, and something which is adoptable throughout any kind of civilization or society. Anyway, coming back to your question, I think it's important to acknowledge that things change. I think that it's important to propel that geography is not just, taught to white people or taught to white men. In fact, my class was mainly women. There were very few Black people in it, but that's fine. It happens. But it's changing. And then also I draw emphasis to the 21st century. Geography is historically a tool of colonial conquest and imperialism. It was used to justify exploration and discovery of the world. It was used to draw maps and discover maps.
And draw them incorrectly.
And yes, that's why I was coming to earlier, socio-political significance of maps. Yeah. So yes, drawing them incorrectly. There's really no up or down to a map. There's no side to side. The UK is in the middle of our maps. In America, they're in the middle, and et cetera, and et cetera. But yes, so I was really drawing a fact and contesting traditional geography in a theoretical sense or ideological sense.
Okay. And I know we're kind of jumping around here, but let's go back to kind of space making and representation. So why is it important to explore race within the context of environmental studies and geography? And I know you've touched on it, but let's go a little bit more layered.
Yeah, of course. So I think it's really important to draw upon race in the context of environmental studies and geography, because in our dominant world order, we kind of view humans and nature, or the living world, but I'll just use nature in this sense because we're talking ideologically. So humans and the natural world are separate. It's a binary. And in that binary, we've been able to historically conquer, dominate, invade, take over nature and really shape it to what we want to be, when actually it doesn't have to be that way. And in a sense, in lots of different marginalized, indigenous, native, or just often overlooked voices and opinions across the world, that's not the way in which nature and humans interact. In fact, there's much more of an interconnected, intrinsic, and mutually beneficial relationship between humans and nature. And it's not humans and nature; it is the living world. Perhaps they don't necessarily say it in that way, but it's not the living. It's not humans and nature. It's not this binary idea. And therefore, I think that it's really important to think about race as well in the context of environmentalism, because race and environmentalism do connect. That would be a whole nother podcast. But you can see in the environmental space how, for a long time, we've really tried to uplift different narratives and different forms of knowing the world and knowing self to really propel where environmentalism has got us today. So, yeah, I think it's really important to think about race and nature in that context, but also to think about it more broadly, because the way in which we operate today is highly, linked to this binary construct of humans and nature. We very easily and every day overconsume. We over-extract resources. We, in fact, resourcified the world, when actually other narratives of the living world do not extract from every corner and every crevice of the planet. In fact, they restore, they preserve, they understand the importance of ecosystems and biology. They understand the importance of world systems and the interconnectedness of world systems, which unfortunately we don't see enough of today.
So, again, like in my mind, and this is just like my very obscure view of kind of environmental issues. I often think, and let's take West Africa or Ghana specifically as an example. I also like the West kind of dump on to them like the things that they want to get rid of, their waste, and they have more of a harmonious lifestyle. Is that wrong to assume that? Are countries like Ghana having a bigger impact on the environment, on the climate crisis than we realise?
Of course. I think that it's really important that you brought that up. I think there are two different ways of approaching your question. So I don't think the West are this big, bad, entity which is ruling the whole world. I would say that I'm part of the West. I'd say you're part of the West. I don't think you're going out of your way to harm the rest of the world. I, in fact, don't think many people from the West believe that they are going out of their way to harm the world. And I don't think people are, doing this on purpose. So I also draw then to various initiatives that have happened from the West and from Europe, from the UK, which have helped the UK, but also helped other people and amplified voices across the world. And I think also in terms of living harmoniously, it's really important not to fetishize Indigenous voices, which I think happens a lot in the environmental discussion, or just in general in cultural identity politics as a whole study. In a lot of cases, there can be a lot of fetishization. Yeah, oh my goodness, of Indigenous and Native beliefs and belief systems when actually people know nothing about them. I am absolutely not, I'm not Indigenous, I'm not Native. I went to Australia and I was studying at the University of Sydney, and I really made an effort when I was talking about anything regarding Aboriginal studies to say that I am not a First Nations person. I will never understand what it feels like or must be like to be of that community. So I think that you have to be careful when you speak so positively and innocently of worldviews that actually you and yourself don't understand. And I hope from what I was saying earlier regarding this idea of interconnectedness of nature, it's not all positive. There are negatives of that. At the end of the day, people do die and people do face hardship through nature. It's not all this easy living, which I think can sometimes be the message and what's kind of amplified when we think about Indigenous voices.
Absolutely. And I think, again, I'm going off on another tangent here. I think there's something interesting here where the West is repackaging this, like you said, living with nature, this easy living, when the reality of it is that's not the case. If you go to any kind of small village or, somewhere remote, that's just not the case. So we're saying like, yeah, live with nature, balance, but actually, like you said, it's the fetishization. And I didn't realize that. And that's why I wanted to bring up the question and kind of ask and get your view on that,
Absolutely. I mean, like, I would love to go and open a homestead with my friends. Yeah, why not? But actually, no, I want my modern comforts to be honest.
Right.
I want some running water. I want various different things. But yeah, it's this idea of repackaged privilege.
Yes.
The people who are moving to these places and opening these spaces and things like that have immense privilege. They have resources to be able to live like that. Completely off topic, but for example, I think there's like ballerina farmer or whatever, and they're like really rich, even though they live on a farm and have this minimal lifestyle where they make their own bread. They are crazily rich, both of them.
Yep.
And so they're able to do this, and it's this packaged kind of unrealistic sense of could reconnect with nature through your phone.
Yeah.
So anyway, and even if we can go on the whole phone tangent and nature and the minerals that come from that, but it's just all insane.
Yeah.
Okay, it's not all insane. It's not. I take that back. It's not all insane, but I think you just need to think a bit more critically about it before you just appraise somebody else's doing.
Absolutely. You led major initiatives at UCL around diversity and inclusion. So what were some of those initiatives and what was the response from faculty and students?
Of course. So whilst I was at UCL, I was the president of the Geographical Society, which is actually one of the oldest societies in the UK. And again, coming back onto this aspect of really propelling this idea of what it means to be a geographer in the 21st century, I created 3 new roles in the society to really and more so represent the cultural diversity of geography today. And in that, I was able to lead initiatives and also organise different events, which really did represent the student body. The reception from the faculty and the student body were fantastic. I mean, actually, I'm not to be biased, but the geography department, shout out to them, at UCL, were really understanding, listening, and really cooperative with what we wanted to do. And they were also, recommending things too. So one of those in which was the formation of the LGBTQ plus network in the geography department. And with the society being so close to the department, we helped lead that initiative. And we were there for the opening ceremony, as it were, which was really fun. We had some cake. There weren't many people there, but I know there's a growing network.
Yeah.
And I guess it was paving the space and a way for further conversations and more amplification of these voices to continue. In terms of other things that I did as well, so I helped to lead the Decolonizing the Curriculum agenda. And in this, I must say, this was 2018. So there wasn't as much urgency around the agenda as there is now. So I kind of was thinking that in the curriculum, there weren't, I mean, in curriculums again broadly, it's kind of always the same writers. Some lecturers may not change the recommended authors or core authors from their programs for years, even decades, and so on and so on. And I really wanted to learn more about voices that I hadn't heard from. And I had lots of questions that weren't answered from the texts. And I know that other people also had the same. And so that's what really came from Decolonizing the Curriculum. It's about deconstructing our knowledge. It's about thinking critically and reflecting what we've been learning to really expand knowledge. Knowledge is not perfect, but you can always expand it and continue to learn. And that, of course, comes from learning from other world perspectives and narratives from across the world. As I said, it was 2018. A lot of the urgency kind of arrived in 2020.
Yeah.
But I do think what we were doing at the time helped pave the way for that smoother, let's say, it wasn't smooth, smoother transition into really deconstructing and rethinking and reestablishing the truth and honesty when it comes to decolonizing the curriculum and allowing students to continue learning.
Absolutely. Again, I'm just like so blown away. So I know a little earlier in the conversation you touched on your time in Australia. So let's dive into that a little bit more. So can we talk about your time in Australia and what lessons did you take from learning about Aboriginal histories and land stewardship?
Of course. So during my second year of university at UCL, I was able to fortunately partake in a year abroad. And I decided to go to Australia. So I went and studied at the University of Sydney for a year. Now, what's really interesting is when I was saying this to my friends, most of my white friends were like, oh my God, like, the most amazing time, like it's going to be fantastic. And a lot of my black friends were like, oh, is it not like racist over there? Like, you sure you want to go?
Yeah.
But I think personally, I would never let that stop me unless my life was at danger. I'm obviously not going to go somewhere I might be attacked physically and really hurt. But I would never let that kind of stop me from adventuring and experiencing a new space. So I went to Australia and it was really fantastic. I was able to travel to all along the East Coast. So that's going to like Bondi. Can I even think of the other places I went to right now? No, but work is busy. So that's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah.
But I did go to Uluru, which is this amazing, huge rock formation in the middle of Australia, which is kind of surrounded by desert and very flat land. But it's amazing. It was an exquisite experience and I really love rock formations. And so, I had some really fantastic experiences, met some amazing people and was able to learn about Aboriginal histories and culture through this module that I did while studying at university. And coming back onto Aboriginal voices, so within the Aboriginal community, it's actually Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander individuals which form the First Nations people. So it's important to note that, I guess, if anyone else doesn't necessarily know. So in this module, which I found transformative to my learning and also my understanding of the world, because it was just a completely different, or not even necessarily the word different, it was just another form of, I guess, experiencing the world that I wasn't exposed to before. And also to point out that the Aboriginal communities in Australia have been living there and have evidence of their history for over 65,000 years.
That's incredible.
Which is a very long time.
Very long time. And sorry to interrupt, that my very basic understanding is they were classified as flora and fauna.
Yeah.
And you've been on the land for 65,000 years. It's the audacity.
The audacity. And the audacity to even invade Australia.
Yeah.
So if we're talking about audacity, so for example, the first invaders, let's call it how it is, or colonists, came to Australia, visited Australia, retreated, came back again, and then after a few years declared Australia as terra nullius, which basically means in Latin no man's land or nobody's land. And they also declared Aboriginal people uncivilized, no civilization in 65,000 years. And when actually, of course, we know that there were many trade networks, there were, and a plethora of languages, there were technologies very advanced in that time and age, and the list goes on and on and on. And also a lot of cultural significance and learning that I was fortunate to be part of during my year abroad. So anyway, and I think coming back to the importance of the module and how I found it so transformative was that I realized that so many of the atrocities that happened in other parts of the world centuries prior, so British people came to Australia in 1788, but so many atrocities that happened in centuries prior across other countries happened again in Australia when they'd already been discredited or kind of understood as actually this shouldn't be happening. For example, there's evidence of slavery in Australia from the late 19th century, so the 1800s and the early 1900s. This is after the Abolition Act.
Wow. This is never spoken about. This is the first time I've heard this.
I know. And like, for example, there was the White Australia policy, which tried to eradicate Aboriginal people. And in doing that, for instance, and when I say assimilation, I don't mean something, positive and innocent and just learn the language. It's not like that.
No.
There's a poster from, I think it was from the 1950s or 60s, could even be 70s, where there are 3 generations of Aboriginal people and each generation's getting lighter. That's what I mean of assimilation. They were culturally and physically trying to whiten the Aboriginal community to eradicate them. And also, there's of course a lot of bloodshed, atrocities happening to them, just people murdering Aboriginal people who have a right to land. So yeah, there was a lot going on.
Yeah.
Also like the stolen generations, for example, that went up until the 1970s. That's so recent. And in the stolen generations, effectively governments, churches and welfare systems forcibly took Aboriginal children from their families and raised them in white households to cause them to forget their sense of identity, languages and connection to land, and also their own understanding of the world around them. So yeah, I just found that it was quite, astonishing that these things were happening so recent, and in which they'd happened in other areas of the world centuries before, but had been understood as, understandably, as wrong.
Yeah. No, and again, I it's almost like, and I say this, it's almost like a secret history learning this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because you hear about obviously the transatlantic slave trade, you hear about slavery in Brazil, but you never, and I have never heard of this happening in Australia, and that's why I call it a secret history. Obviously, it's not, but in terms of how we focus our lens on what slavery was and what it meant, leaving them out of the conversation is such a huge disservice. And I don't really understand why, but that's really interesting to kind of learn that today.
Yeah, I think because Australia is just so far away from, I guess, what was the heart of colonial rule in the UK, and obviously messages took a lot longer to be pushed over here and vice versa. It just kind of got sadly forgotten or just overseen, I guess. And I think, when we think about decolonizing the curriculum, it's about telling the truth and being honest. And I think some people see decolonizing the curriculum, I don't think they actually believe in it, but I think they see it as hating your history. It's not about hating your history. It's just about being more representative of history and about who's telling that story. It's about deconstructing and reestablishing and relearning all the voices or more of the voices in the story. And if we had more of a decolonial approach to history, perhaps we could learn more about Aboriginal histories, not just about, I'm telling stories of Aboriginal people being really harmed and murdered, but actually they had a lot of agency and resistance, which was another theme from the module that I learned too. These histories that we speak about, slavery and Black histories and everything else, it's like we're speaking about these people as though they had nothing. They had nothing to them. They couldn't do anything. They were literally helpless. Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that when you're speaking and learning about these things, which I'm really drawing an emphasis to, it's not just about speaking about, bloodshed and murder. It's about also speaking about how these people have agency in their spaces and also formed examples of resistance and continue to resist. Aboriginal people were always resisting colonial rule throughout history and still continue to do so today. And I think it's important to highlight that.
Absolutely. It has to be a balanced conversation, and there is power, there is strength, and, you know, to not mention that would be a huge disservice. And again, I think of Haiti immediately when we talk about resistance.
Absolutely.
So no, it is fantastic and important to highlight that. So moving forward a little bit now. So when we think of today and tomorrow, you know, the diaspora and the climate crisis, and I think we have gone into this in great length, but I'm going to question it again. So how do you think the climate crisis uniquely impacts the Black diaspora, and what knowledge or action do you think is most urgent?
Of course. So I think this is actually a really broad question.
Yeah.
Let me try and think. So I think that I can only speak to my own experience because, of course, the Black diaspora in Brazil, in China, in Australia, even France, we completely, you know, we have different understandings of life. I think, in fact, everybody's, connection to the environmental crisis is unique. But if I think about my own, and in the context of
let's say in the context of the UK, then
in the context of the UK and my diasporic experience, I think that it shapes my connection because I have a connection to more than one place, and therefore I feel as though I have a responsibility to more than one place. And that connection, I think everyone has connection to places. I'm not trying to denote anyone's connection to place. As I said, everyone has this unique experience to the places in which they interact with. But I think for me, my connectedness with Ghana, my connectedness with Manchester, which is where my mum's from. I'm also half Ghanaian. My connectedness with the Caribbean, even though it's not as personal as I'd like it to be, really does shape my understanding of the climate crisis. In the UK, I think we are very shielded from the climate crisis. You know, we're not experiencing hurricanes. We're not experiencing +4 degrees of temperature, even though this has been the warmest spring on record.
Yeah, I'm very suspicious of it.
Yeah. So no, I think that we're very shielded from the climate crises. And knowing that, and also knowing that, you know, the Caribbean and places in Ghana and places across the world where the diaspora more broadly are from, are going through this, you're like, whoa, what can I do to help this? What can I do to really create an action? What can I do to influence something? And so coming on to impact and influence, I think there are a few stages when we're thinking about impact and action. And for me, that's centered in engagement. The first aspect of engagement would be to learn, to interact with something. So that means picking up a book. That might mean watching something whilst I'm doom scrolling, or trying to doom scroll more into like a certain pathway or avenue to like learn about it. And then also within that first stage, or even the second stage, it's about opening your mouth to other people, speaking about what you've been thinking of, or speaking about what you've been interacting with. You can even have that person also read that passage, or also watch that form of media and see what their perspective is. And if it's different, also welcome it. I think that when we're thinking about action and impact, we're not very comfortable to speak to somebody who's not showing the same values as us. That's not how you create action. That's not how you create change or impact if you're not speaking to somebody with the same voice as you. For example, love my siblings, love my brother, but we have different opinions on the world. We have different political opinions, but we argue a lot, we debate a lot, we have lots of conversations, and we both learn from each other. So I think in that second stage, you need to ensure that you're not living in a silo. You're not learning in a silo when it comes to action and impact, because otherwise you're unfortunately only going to have action and impact within that silo, not beyond it. And then the third kind of aspect of action, I think, is critically reflecting on yourself and critically reflecting on what you've been reading. In that sense, I mean, who's created this? Where do they live? How old are they? When was this written? Was it written, in 1880, which is when some things are written, obviously. Was it written recently? Was it written by a journalist? Was it written by someone who went to Oxford? Was it written by AI, for goodness sake? Lots of things to consider nowadays. But you need to also reflect and think about how you can bring other narratives into your opinion, and therefore, and especially this is key in the environmental crisis, therefore that goes beyond that goes beyond reading people, many of which the writers historically in the environmental space have been cis white male. That's not a problem. It's only a problem if you only read from them.
Right.
So I think, you need to have some sort of critical reflection of self to really develop as a person. And then I think the fourth kind of stage before it kind of loops on itself is to think about how you can create that action. So as I said, I think throughout each of these stages, you are creating action. But if you want to do the final stage, it's like, how can you innovatively create something different or join someone else who is doing that? And from that, I guess for me, my attempt or my experience to challenge myself and experience and really make that action was to go to Ghana for my master's research at the University of Oxford and study on the extractive industries of underwater logging, which is often overlooked. What is underwater logging? No one actually really knows. I do, and people who are experiencing it do. But it's really overlooked in the environmental kind of area. So I was critiquing that and kind of that in the colonial realm. And then from that, fortunately, I was able to then work as an independent climate consultant at the Red Cross and continue my exploration of climate change, thankfully also in Ghana as well as other countries through different projects, and really help propel the Ghanaian government and also the Ghanaian Red Cross's climate agenda.
And so, final thoughts, kind of what gives you hope, and what are your hopes for the next generation and how they'll engage with climate justice?
Of course. I'm actually really excited to see how the next generation are continuing and will continue to engage with climate crises. This is a tricky question. I'm going to keep it open. So I'm going to talk more about what I hope they don't do. I hope, which I think some people from my generation and perhaps just a generation before, who kind of blame older generations on the environmental crises and not doing enough. I hope that they can see that we've tried to do a lot when it comes to impact and trying to minimize the environmental crises. I can't say it's enough. Will it ever be enough? I don't know. Who knows? But I would hope that they don't think that we haven't done enough. I would hope that they are innovative. I would hope that they are understanding. I would hope that they also amplify voices which haven't been, spoken to. I would also hope that they amplify voices that haven't been uplifted prior. I would hope that they also this is a really good question. I would hope that they don't continue on a business as usual or think that it's too late to make a difference.
Yeah.
I sometimes think, gosh, is it too late to make a difference? I think other people around me think, gosh, is it too late to make a difference? Maybe I should just, use that plastic straw, or throw that plastic bag in the rubbish, or not really care about the recycling, or, fly to wherever or whatnot, because the damage has already been done. But I hope that they continue this emotion and this feeling of wanting to make a change and an impact. I hope that they don't feel as though it's a burden on them. I sometimes feel as though it's a challenge which, is it possible? But it is possible. It just takes different viewpoints and different lenses to really see that. In that, I hope that they do use other forms of knowing the world and knowing self and I hope that they do bring that into the climate crises and the agenda towards that. For example, not just seeing the world through this capitalist lens, really thinking about other worldviews and bringing us even further into the climate debate. I also hope, one other thing, that when people think about the environment and think about people who care about the environment, they're not just thinking that you have to be, some, quite very outspoken vegan, wearing all green. I'm actually vegan, been vegan for 5 years, I will say.
Yeah.
They're not thinking about the fact you have to be some advocate, really aggressively an advocate for nature and an advocate
tying
for
yourself to the road type of thing.
You don't have to do that.
Right. No, I kind of share the same sentiment as you, as I'm stuck between this line of it's the billionaires. Like, so why should I worry about using Chat GPT or, I recycle. But again, I think there is a little bit more call to action. If each one of us takes a little bit more responsibility, then, we can kind of really create some real change.
Definitely agree.
But thank you so much. I knew this conversation was going to be fantastic. I knew it was needed. I knew it was going to be in depth. I knew you was going to bring some real kind of expertise and knowledge to it. So just thank you so much for being the representation that we so desperately need, and for all the work that you're doing and for the work that you will continue to do. So what I'd like to do now is I usually ask my guests about their values. So a value for your personal life and a value for your professional life. And it's just to kind of leave our listeners thinking about values and what they value in their own life. So if you could share your personal life first, and then we'll go on to professional.
Of course. Well, also, I would say thank you to you, Zoe, for having the space to open up this conversation. And I think much needed conversations throughout your podcast. This was episode 29?
Yes.
Episode 29, exactly. Yeah. So I think you actually opening up the space, and the fact that we met and you took interest in what I was saying and I took interest and trusted in what you were saying to come here and be here today is really, really important. So thank you, Zoe, first and foremost. Back to the values. It's difficult to separate my personal and professional life at the moment, right, because they're so intertwined. And I think I'm just going through an era of change anyway. So I'll conjoin them if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think if I'm going to conjoin them, I would say the values that I align to most would be empowerment, would be community, would be open-mindedness, so not being naive and not being ignorant. It would also be patience too. I think patience is important because people don't change their decisions or their minds overnight. That doesn't happen. And, I might not change someone's decision to do whatever they want to do through this podcast. I might not change any of your opinions through this podcast, but it takes time. And it takes that open-mindedness to really consider other viewpoints. I think those are the main ones I can think of that come to mind right away. I'm sure if I, thought harder, I might think of some others, but those are the main ones that come to mind.
No, I think they're brilliant.
Authentic.
Yeah, no, I think they're absolutely brilliant points to leave us on. If people want to follow your journey, where can they find you?
Of course. So my Instagram is Adwoa.Amankona. That's ADWOA.Kona. Otherwise, I'm probably best on LinkedIn, I have to say. Sorry to get that professional slobber out there.
All good.
It's probably best to contact me on LinkedIn, which is Adwoa Amankona. So I guess that will be in the bio or written somewhere. I won't spell my whole name out.
I'll put it on. Yep.
Amazing. So yeah, that'd be best to reach me. Or by email.
Amazing.
Somewhere on LinkedIn.
Okay. Amazing. Thank you so much once more. Guys, thank you so much for joining us once more. And again, if you enjoyed this episode, please like, follow, subscribe and share. Thank you.